Okay, everybody. Well, good evening and welcome to our 20th class in our journey through Jewish history. It's pretty surreal to think that we started this, I think, about 6 or 7 months ago, and we have now made it through basically all of Jewish history, hitting really the main points. So, like I said, probably in October or September when we began, really the goal of this is not to obviously go through every single era and episode of Jewish history, because each and every class that we had really could be the subject of an entire study in and of itself, but really to just set the basic blocks in motion so that anytime any of us come across any major theme or trend or idea in Jewish history, we are able to sort of put it within a wider context to understand both the historical timeline and the geographic regional timeline of Jewish history. We can trace back ideas, and we'll do a little bit of conclusion at the end here, but one of the things that I want to keep reiterating, I think I said this at the outset, and just to say it one more time, is that Judaism doesn't view the study of history as something that's necessarily important for its own sake. And there's actually no word for history in biblical Hebrew, but we do have tons of words for recalling the past. We usually use the word memory or zachor. And plenty of things we do throughout the Jewish tradition have at the root this idea of Zachor, right? We have Shabbat Zachor once a year where we remember what the Amalekites did to us. We have Yizkor, obviously, an important ritual to remember people that have passed, right? Zachor becomes the central word in Yom HaShoah, in remembering the Holocaust. And when we actually tease out this word Zachor and what it means to really remember in a Jewish context, it's almost never because we are intellectually or academically interested in what happened, whether we're talking about 15 years ago or 2000 years ago, but we actually think there's something about learning from the past that can inspire us now and actually cause us to change the future. And so I really hope that our study of Jewish history hasn't just been an interesting historical exercise of visiting a metaphorical museum of Jewish history, but really inspiring current and future Jewish practice and other ways to think about Judaism. And just one other thing that I want to say at the outset here, and I'll say this again right before we conclude, but a big trend in terms of Jewish studies and Jewish history isn't, again, just supposed to be a museum-like walk through history, but the ideas really do repeat themselves in every generation. And so just like the Passover Seder every year, where we say in every generation, a person is commanded to view themselves as leaving through Egypt, some of the major themes throughout Jewish history, whether they be some of the more sad themes in terms of all the trials and tribulations that Jews have gone through over the course of years, whether it be the need to pivot in terms of rituals and ideology, or even geographical regions, right? These ideas continuously reoccur throughout Jewish history. And hopefully the next time any of us come across, let's say, new ideas or the clash between innovation and tradition and all these things, we don't write things off as, oh, this is either too traditional or this is too innovative, because the study of Jewish history is full of ideas that are both steeped in tradition and innovation. And so a little bit more on that later. For now, I want to, close all these browsers and me sending the link to a bunch of people. But I want to share my screen, and we will go at it in our last session. So last time we really spent the whole time talking about Israel, and we actually only hit about 18 years of Israel's existence from 1948 to 1967, which is really an 18-year gap that, as we talked about for about an hour last week, is probably the most pivotal 20 years in all of Jewish history. If we think about the end and aftermath of the Holocaust, to the subsequent founding of the state of Israel, to the early wars that really challenged Israel's whether or not it was going to exist or not, to Israel becoming the center of world Jewry, both in terms of refugee, in terms of culture, and all these things. And then that sort of culminated in the Six-Day War, which again, we spoke about a lot last time, that led to massive territorial expansions by Israel and a lot of the wider political, social, geographical, ethical, whatever we want to deem it, questions that are really at the heart of Israeli society and the Jewish world today. We sort of left off last time right after 1967. And so one thing that I just want to reiterate, and then we'll move on to the 70s, is the Six-Day War was such an emotional roller coaster for world Jewry that in terms of how it affected diasporic Jewry, and when I say diasporic, now I'm really talking about North American, because as we discussed last time, one sad result of the Six-Day War is all of the Muslim and Arab countries that hadn't yet expelled their Jews after 1948, by the end of 1967, there were basically no Jews living in the Arab world left. There were maybe a couple hundred scattered throughout, but really 1967 war, because of the perceived or the actual humiliation that the Arab world confronted that day, it really was the end of Judaism in a lot of countries that, again, throughout the course of this history, we've seen that the Jewish history in places like Iraq or places like Egypt and other places really stretched thousands of years. And that sort of was the last chapter in Jewish history in these places. It also led to a resurgence in the American Jewish community. And this is when you start to see a lot of American Jewish initiatives where the American Jewish community evolved from tacitly supporting Israel to what I'll call proudly supporting Israel. And it's at that time that you start to see a lot of American Jewish, say, celebration of Israeli Independence Day, right? Which is something that probably if you went back to the year 1955, maybe people would acknowledge it, but there would not be different synagogues and Hillels and Jewish federations and JCCs throwing massive parties and carnivals every year on Yom HaAtzmaut. That was really born in the late 1960s and early 70s. And actually, one other really interesting way to view this parallel, this will be the last thing I say, just concluding from last time, is there was a professor named Mark Dollinger, I'm forgetting which university he's at, but he wrote a very interesting book where he discusses the parallel of what he calls American Jewish pride, and talking about how the 70s in general was a time in American society where different groups went from scared to show their individuality or particularity in an outward way to basically wearing their identity on their sleeve. And there's obviously a lot of pros and cons that comes with that, so we can discuss that another time. But for at least the American Jewish community, this is where you start to see the outward practice of Judaism in a way that really hadn't been seen before. And the Six-Day War certainly had its fair share to play in the role of making American Jews not just saying, yeah, we're Jewish, but when we go out on the street, we are not Jewish, but actually really proud of Judaism and Israel and Zionism and sort of the wider cultural framework. So just one of the things that we didn't quite get to last week, we started to discuss it, but this is actually going to be crucial in terms of the turning point in the 70s and 80s in terms of both the Israeli populace and in terms of politics, is the wider story of the Mizrahi Jews. And I want to say just at the outset, even the generalization of a slide on a PowerPoint that's talking about Mizrahi Jews is, again, woefully inadequate, because this is in some way lumping an entire community together that is as diverse as from Yemen to Syria, communities that had fairly little to do with each other pre-Israel, aside from the fact that they were under Islamic control in the Arab world. But the story of Mizrahi Jews, I think, creates a really interesting spin in a lot of ways in the wider story of Israel, both, I think, in terms of the importance, centrality, and need for Zionism on the one hand, and also in the second hand, to challenge assumptions that Ashkenazi Jews might have about Zionism and about certain elements of the country that seem very foreign to what I'll call the Ashkenazi dominant way of seeing things. And so just to tell this story a little bit of background, because everybody here has been at, at least most of the last 19 sessions, it's of no surprise to everybody here that for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, there have been a heavy Jewish presence all throughout the Middle East, which, by the way, surprisingly, when I teach similar things on, let's say, college campuses to college students, they're shocked to hear that there has been Jewish presence in Iraq and Iran and Libya and Syria over the past 2,000 years. And so this is something that I've learned, right? Obviously not to this group, but in a general audience, even that fact is new to a lot of people whose sort of view of Jewish history tends to be, after Jews left Israel, they sort of all moved to Europe. And all Jews are just Ashkenazi Jews, and that's sort of most people's default setting story of Jewish history. And so the Mizrahi Jewish population, of which we spoke a lot about, obviously under Islamic rule for the past 1400 years. And we spoke probably a month ago, that starting in the mid 1800s, but then getting worse throughout the 1900s, life started getting increasingly worse for Mizrahi Jews. And so one of the big flashpoints that we discussed, just by way of introduction, is that life for Jews under Islamic rule was generally better than Jews under Christian rule in the Middle Ages. When I say generally better, it still would not come close to the threshold of what we would consider equality today. So Jews have always been under dhimmi status, which was basically religious legal enforcement of second-class citizens, which on the one hand, being a second-class citizen does mean you have some rights because you have an acknowledged citizenship. On the other hand, I don't think anybody today would settle for a second-class citizenship in any country and claim that that is in some way fair or equal. One of the things that happened to the wider Mizrahi Jewish population that we touched on a number of times is, as the Zionist movement gained steam, the local countries started viewing their Jews as more and more of a threat. And this gets into really interesting overlapping between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which we'll return to in about 20 minutes. But I just wanted to say this because I find that this statement is oftentimes interesting to people who have never thought of it like this. In some way, the Mizrahi Jewish community highlights the fact that it is very difficult to separate out anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism. Now, it doesn't mean they're always the same, right? It is possible to separate them. But one of the things that happened to Jews throughout the Arab world is, regardless of their opinion of Israel and Zionism, they were ipso facto lumped in with Israel just because they're Jews. And this happened all throughout the Arab world, right? There's some particular nefarious examples that happened in Egypt. But one of the things that happened to really Jews all over the world is they were lumped in with the state of Israel in a way that eventually led to their being expelled from the country. And so we see up here on the right over here that you can see the Jewish population in the Arab world in 1948. So right before Israel was established, it was almost 1 million. It was 8,500,000. Now, in the year, this was made in 2012, they estimate about 4,000. Almost all of these 4,000, by the way, the number's a lot smaller now, are elders that just didn't end up leaving the community. And so there's basically very few, if not zero, new Jews moving to the wider Arab world. And again, you can also see on this map in general, these are Arab states showing the number of Jews who ended up leaving their home countries and settling in Israel between 48 and 72. So really the time that we're in right now. And we also spoke about, again, the dualistic notion of, on the one hand, Israel was the safe haven for many of these Mizrahi Jews. Israel led daring rescue missions to save many of these Mizrahi Jews. But then when a lot of them got to the country of Israel, they were treated really badly. And all it takes is a couple of Google searches to find exact examples and case studies. Probably the worst, if I had to give the worst thing that happened, again, so this is not something that was widespread, but just something that, historians know to be true, is called the Yemenite Children Affair. And it's a story of a couple dozen, if not hundreds, of Yemenite babies who were taken by the state of Israel. Their families were told that the babies died in the hospital, and they were secretly given to Ashkenazi families that weren't able to have kids for a variety of reasons. I do not want to paint the picture that this was commonplace, but there are a number of very well-documented cases of this happening. And again, this just goes into the wider trend where, again, you have a secular Ashkenazi majority who had a vision of what they wanted a country to be like. And one of the quotes that I think even Herzl said, again, Herzl was long dead by 1948, but one of his quotes for what he wanted in Israel was, he said, we want a Vienna in the Middle East. And so again, if you think about just the type of society that in the year, let's say 1947, a lot of Ashkenazi labor, again, they were predominantly socialist Zionists, wanted, that was definitely not the type of society and culture that the 800 plus thousand Mizrahi Jews were practicing or had in mind when they entered the country. So there was certainly a huge clash here. And there's a fascinating quote by Ben-Gurion, who was asked to weigh in on this question of who is a Jew, right? Again, this endlessly perplexing question that Jews in every generation have had to deal with. One of the things we spoke about 2 times ago was that Israel has had to deal with this question in a much more concrete way, because given that the right of return was passed right after the state was founded, Israel actually needs a legal definition over who is a Jew. And so there was a time in the early 1940s or the mid 1940s where they were asking all these public Jewish intellectuals, how would you define who a Jew is? And in some of Ben-Gurion's answer, he says, in Israel, efforts must be made to increase shared and unifying properties and eliminate as far as possible those that separate and divide. And so this very well sums up, again, the mentality of what the early Zionists were trying to do on the one hand, which gets into our larger conversation of their cultural ideology, which was one steeped in socialism. And when I say that, I'm not saying that in a demeaning way. It really was this type of mentality where we are all in it together and we are all just a part of this wider thing that we're trying to create. In some ways, that was probably very beneficial. In some ways, it ends up being very terrible when you have a top-down governmental system that's trying to enforce the opposite of human nature. And this is obviously one of the ways in which this backfired in Israel in very important ways. And so we're getting to the 1970s, and I believe in 1971, Israel had its own version of the Black Panther movement, again, inspired by the American Black Panther movement, but it started with a couple of rallies or riots, depending on which verb you want to use, in Jerusalem, and eventually spread. And this was, again, the first time really in Israel that you have the Mizrahi Jewish community coming into the public and really speaking out against what they saw to be the Ashkenazi injustice towards them. And this ends up culminating about 10 years later into a political party called Shas. It's a little bit more complicated than a direct line because the Black Panther movement was mostly secular in nature, whereas Shas was and still is ultra-Orthodox. But this idea of Mizrahi political power being used not just in terms of their own community, but the Mizrahi Jewish community thinking correctly so that they should have just as much a say over the political happenings of the state. And so the founding of Shas is probably one of the more important political things to ever happen in Israel. And we'll see why in a few minutes. So Shas, I believe, didn't actually get into the Knesset until the mid 1980s. But one of the most important things that happens in Israel in the mid 70s, and we'll discuss this a little bit more in depth in a second, is the power switches. And this is basically going to be the most important political swing that happens in Israel's history, because a lot of people read early Zionist literature and they see that from 1948 to 1977, it was a socialist labor secular government that was running the country. And any news flashes coming out of Israel today, regardless of one's opinion about Israel, it is not secular, not socialist. And so a lot of people see what's happening and they say, well, how did Israel turn into this secular, socialist, labor type country into, let's say, Benjamin Netanyahu's Israel run by the party Likud? And the Mizrahi Jewish community has one of these central roles to play in this community, because one of the ways in which Menachem Begin came to power, and he was the first Likud prime minister of Israel, and we spoke about him a number of sessions ago, so I don't want to introduce him too much, is by mobilizing the Mizrahi Jewish community against the Ashkenazi elite. And so if you were in Israel in the mid 1970s, there were huge political campaigns. And one of the things that Menachem Begin often used to say is the Ashkenazi socialists in the kibbutzim with their swimming pools, as a way to basically say the Ashkenazi elite are just trying to keep power and they have all these lofty ideas, but that isn't actually trickling down to the average Mizrahi voter. And to some extent, Menachem Begin led a populist movement. On the other hand, a lot of the critiques that he was making of Israeli society were correct. And so everyone here can judge for themselves. And I wanted to show actually a short video. I don't think I've showed a video before, but this is oftentimes an interesting trivia question that I like to ask people, because one of the reasons why I like to focus so much on the Mizrahi Jewish community is that, given that the American Jewish community is largely Ashkenazi, a lot of things that are happening in Israel are just tough to understand from an Ashkenazi-centric perspective. And when I say Ashkenazi-centric, I don't mean this among ethnic lines necessarily. I mean that the Ashkenazi Jewish community went through the Enlightenment, and we spent an entire class talking about the Enlightenment. And one of the most important conclusions about the Enlightenment in Judaism is that it doesn't matter what type of Jew one is. One could be ultra-Orthodox, one could be modern Orthodox, one could be Reform, one could be an atheist, one could be Reconstructionist. If you were an Ashkenazi Jew, you were in some way affected by the Enlightenment, whether it made you more liberal, whether it made you more fundamentalist, right? All of Ashkenazi Jewry is refracted from the Enlightenment, which really hit the entire Ashkenazi Jewish world. Again, you can decide for yourself whether for better or worse, but the wider Mizrahi Jewish world did not go through the Enlightenment. And so their way of Judaism was just entirely different, right? It was almost as if the Ashkenazi Jewish community never went through this entire refractory period. And so the two communities oftentimes have a hard time understanding each other. And this is the reason why I like showing this video, is because I oftentimes start it with a trivia question. And I'm actually curious to get some answers in the comments. What was, and I believe still is, this happened about 10 years ago, the most attended funeral in Jewish history? This is your trivia question. I'll take a minute for guesses. All right, got a couple private comments. Someone said Ben Gurion. That is incorrect. Mark says Begin, which is a great guess. It is also incorrect. Okay, so we have also Sephardic chief rabbi. So yes. So I want to show this with one minute news clip from, I believe, the Euronews, and then we can discuss in a second.
His coffin carried by Israel's political elite. More than 500,000 mourners have attended the funeral of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who died at the age of 93. He was seen as a spiritual leader of Israel's Sephardic Jews and founded the ultra-Orthodox Shas party. However, Rabbi Yosef was a controversial figure, dubbed Israel's Ayatollah by critics, who condemned many of his comments as racist and homophobic. Prime Minister Netanyahu paid tribute to him, saying he worked greatly to enhance Jewish heritage, and at the same time his rulings took into consideration the times and the realities of renewed life in the state of Israel. Palestinian President Abbas sent his condolences, saying, "We met on several occasions, had prolonged discussions, and wanted his condolences sent to the family." Born in Iraq, Yosef came to Jerusalem when he was just 4 and was ordained as a rabbi at the age of 20. He'll be remembered for helping improve the situation of Sephardic Jews within Israel.
All right, so Rav Ovadia Yosef, I believe they estimate that 600,000 people showed up to his funeral, which I think makes it the largest attended funeral in Jewish history. This was 10 years ago, even though both Mahmoud Abbas and Bibi are still the respective prime ministers of the PA in Israel. Don't think this was made yesterday, although the political leadership might belie that a little bit. But again, this is a name that is largely unknown by the American Jewish community. And just in a way that I think highlights the fact that to some extent, the American Jewish community is living in different echo chambers and ideological bubbles than a lot of Israelis. And I don't say this to push any specific political viewpoint or religious viewpoint. I mean, personally, I'm somebody who, was very familiar with Rav Ovadia Yosef's writings, and personally find a lot of it problematic in a religious or philosophical or ethical sense. But that's beyond the point. The point is there aren't that many Jews in the world, right? And this is something we've talked about over the course of this course. There's about 12 or 13 million, depending on exactly how you count, million Jews in the world. And this is somebody that had 600,000 out of about 12 million people there. So somebody could do the math, but this is about 4 or 5% of Jews in the world attended this funeral. And, hundreds of thousands of more watched online or things like that. And it's a name that's largely unfamiliar to half the Jews in the world, just as a way in which how divided a lot of American Jews are from the intercultural and interreligious playings of the state of Israel. And I mentioned this article last time, but I wanted to just tag it one more time because I find it a very provocative article. And it was by Matti Friedman. And he writes an article saying that nobody hijacked Israel. It's just not what they thought they'd created. And the whole point, and just to read one quote, and then we'll carry on after this Mizrahi Jewish section, is he says, many Israelis think the basis of the country is the European Jewish world, Herzl and Ben Gurion, and that the Jews of the Middle East then came and joined that story. I think it's the opposite. Israel is part of the continuum of Judaism in the Muslim world, together with the remnants of European Jewry. And so what Matti Friedman does in this article is he completely challenges the common understanding of Zionism, that Zionism was a post-Enlightenment Ashkenazi Jewish project. And he says, well, what if we actually viewed Zionism as the opposite? What if we viewed Zionism as there had been a continued Jewish presence in the Middle East over the last 2,000 years? This should be viewed as part of that. And also the remnants of Ashkenazi Jewry also ended up joining that story. And then in a lot of ways, the wider politics and religious discussions of the region suddenly make a lot more sense. And again, this isn't to defend any political viewpoint or any specific political disposition of Israel, but oftentimes thinking of Israel as if it's just a continuation of Europe, as opposed to thinking of Israel as a continuation of the Middle East, creates a lot of confusion for people who are shocked that Israel does X, Y, or Z when X, Y, and Z is commonplace in the Middle East, as opposed to viewing Israel through a European lens. Okay, only so we don't get stuck with some more to do. Let's move on. We have about 2 or 3 more historical points and then just some overall concluding for this class. So one other crucial war in which to understand both the history of Israel and also contemporary Israel is the Yom Kippur War that happens just 6 years after the Six-Day War. And in some ways, the timing of this war is more important than necessarily what even happens in the war, because just to understand what the sentiment was in wider Israel between 1967 and 1973 was there was truly this feeling of invincibility throughout the Israeli and wider Jewish world, to the point where if you read histories and military histories of the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli intelligence, even though all the signs were there that both Egypt and Syria were amassing forces on the border, the top generals and security officials basically thought that it was beyond the realm of possibility that Israel would ever be attacked because they had so easily won in 1967. The thinking among the intelligence elite in Israel was Egypt and Syria and whoever else would have to be insane to launch another war. What they didn't necessarily know, and this is again connected to something we spoke about last time, was that throughout the late 60s and early 70s, the Soviet Union was increasingly supplying Egypt and Syria with more and more weaponry. Again, a whole other way in which I mentioned to view the Israeli-Arab conflict is through the wider Soviet American or communistic democratic conflict that's been happening in terms of geopolitics over the last 100 years. But all of a sudden, Israel finds itself completely surprised in terms of an attack, obviously on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, which to some extent, right, and there's some really interesting military analyses here. One of the difficult things in the Yom Kippur War, and really any surprise attack war against Israel, and this is the same thing with modern Israeli military, is that a lot of Israel's military power comes from its massive number of reserves that the Israeli IDF has. And so just one obvious thing, but just to say it, Israel has mandatory army service for the vast majority of Jews that grow up in the country. I say the majority because one of the big political battles that has been happening for the last generation or so is whether or not the ultra-Orthodox community has to also serve in the army, which we can maybe discuss a little bit later. But that means that any person who's living in Israel that's above the age of 18 is either currently or has served in the military before. And so at any one time, there aren't that many Israeli soldiers on duty, but in case of a massive war, such as what happened in either 1967 or 1973, one of the reasons why Israel is such a military superpower is they have all of these soldiers on reserves. Now, if Israel's surprised, or if the generals or the commanders of the army are assuming that the attack is a bluff and they don't call up the reserves, it takes about a week to fully mobilize. Now, a lot of military analyses of the Yom Kippur War, there was a really interesting one just called the Yom Kippur War. I'm trying to remember the author's name, but I'll look it up in a second. So for anybody who's interested in military strategy, a lot of military analyses say that it was actually lucky that this was on Yom Kippur, for the very simple reason that the roads in Israel are virtually empty on Yom Kippur. And one of the toughest things in terms of mobilizing troops, and this is something that happens in the Lebanon wars that Israel's had, this actually also happened in early 1967, is the roads just get completely jammed. And especially at an earlier stage in Israel's infrastructure, where Israel didn't exactly have, 10-lane highways like we do in Southern California, if you have one or two roads that are leading through the Sinai or through the Golan Heights, and one car, or one tank, or one cargo ship breaks down or something, that can clog the entire road. On Yom Kippur, right, it happens to be that in Israel, the roads are almost completely devoid of people. And also secondarily, a lot of people are together. And so you read a lot of stories of the Yom Kippur War, and one by one, as the news got to different synagogues around Israel, everybody started to go home. And there are some really interesting accounts of different rabbis of communities in the middle of services in Israel telling people, whatever you're doing, go home and break your fast, because you might be called up. And as we know in Judaism, any potential chance to save life overrides even eating on Yom Kippur. So go home, break your fast, and get ready to be called up. But despite all of this, the Yom Kippur War really was, in some way, the biggest test to some extent that Israel's ever had militarily, because Israel was caught totally unprepared. And in the early days of the war, both Syria and Egypt made great strides. Egypt almost took over the Sinai within about a week. The Syrians almost took back the Golan Heights. And once you get past the Golan Heights, all you have is just tons of cities and civilians. And so the Yom Kippur War was a time that, again, really tested Israel's fortitude. One other just important thing, right? We can, of course, spend an entire class talking just about the Yom Kippur War, but America sent weaponry, but America refused to send troops, right? That was a conversation between the Israeli government and the American government. And as a result, right, Israel, which felt on the brink of invincibility, was completely taken by surprise. You have Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan was the famous general from 1967. He was, this is all rumors, but I think they're substantiated rumors. He was going around saying that this is going to be the destruction of the third temple being a metaphor for the state of Israel. And so this really was a time where Israel might have fallen to some extent. And I think I remarked actually last time, one of the reasons why questions over geographical compromise in Israel are so tough is that if Israel had, after 1967, given back all of the land that they conquered, and then they were caught in a war such as the Yom Kippur War, it might have actually destroyed the country. And so it was probably the case that the buffer zones of Sinai and the Golan Heights allowed Israel to basically spend time calling up the reserves and figuring out how to launch a defensive against Syria and Egypt. What the Yom Kippur War is also important for, just before I go there, just some interesting pictures. I read a fascinating book that was called Leonard Cohen and the Sinai. I read that a few months ago, and Leonard Cohen, obviously the famous American Jewish singer, visited the Sinai during the Yom Kippur War and went to different squadrons of Israeli soldiers' troops and played for them. And he did this without any fanfare, without any paparazzi. This was not a publicity stunt. It was because he really deeply cared and he wanted to do something. And what he his attempt to help the Israeli war effort was to go and try to liven up the spirits of Jewish soldiers that were camped out in the Sinai. And there's some really interesting accounts from that story. And actually some of his more famous songs may or may not have been written in the Sinai. You can look up that history there. It's really interesting. But the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, in terms of Israel's history, is probably more important than the actual war, because this led to the firing of all top military officials. And this was, again, one of the death blows that the Israeli left were going to have, because, again, this was a leadership that was completely Mapai, right? And when I say Mapai, this was left over from Ben-Gurion and the socialist labor politicians in Israel. And this is the last time that a real socialist would ever run the country. Even later labor prime ministers such as Yitzhak Rabin were no longer the old school from Eastern Europe socialist elite. They were much more the born in Israel, right, made their way up through the military as opposed to through politics. And so this, again, created the major sea change to open the door for Likud and the right wing taking control of Israel. And even more importantly, perhaps, this war paradoxically opens up the possibility for peace with Egypt. And there's a lot of interesting analyses here. And so I'll just say one thing and then we'll pause if anybody has any comments or questions. There was, again, a huge humiliation that the wider Arab world faced after 1967. And depending on how much credit you want to give what I'm about to say, and I'm just repeating things that I've read, right? Culturally, if there's been a huge affront to a variety of countries, they weren't going to let their dignity go unchecked. And so in a lot of ways, the Yom Kippur War was less an attempt to destroy Israel, although certainly it was, but I don't think Egypt or Syria thought they would destroy Israel. This was an attempt to show the region or the world that they are not as bad as their armies did in 1967, that they could hang with Israel militarily and they can exert a little bit of their dominance as well. And to some extent that worked, because while Israel technically won the war, and I'm using air quotes, Israel didn't really consider it a victory because of the number of soldiers that were lost and because of the time that it took. And it really did shack Israel's sense of invincibility. And so after this war, Egypt and its leader Anwar Sadat were sufficiently proud of what they had done that this actually opened the door for a couple of years later, the head of Egypt actually flying to Israel, speaking in front of the Knesset. And then in 1979, Israel and Egypt actually signing a peace treaty, which was important because this was the first time Israel had signed any peace treaty with any of its neighbors or really any country in the Arab world. And so the aftermath of Yom Kippur War really led to the current state of Israel, where Israel and Egypt have had a cold peace, at least for the last 45 years, and even maybe evolving into more of a collaborative cold peace, as opposed to a we want nothing to do with you cold peace. We can talk about that a little bit. So just to go through the 1970s, because we touched on a number of these events, right? We have the Black Panther movement in 71. Menachem Begin, right? This is a picture of Menachem Begin, gets elected in 77. And then in 1979, Israel signs a peace treaty with Egypt. In return for that peace treaty, Israel gives back the Sinai to Egypt. And so again, that massive territory right south of Israel that Israel conquered in 1967, about 12 years later, Israel gives that back to Egypt. And then here, but before we go to the 80s, I would love to hear any thoughts or opinions, questions about any and all of this. Perfect. I guess peace with Egypt is not that controversial. But there is one more thing that I want to say, actually, that is interesting and maybe not controversial, but I think provocative food for thought to some extent, is the right wing in Israel and Likud and the legacy of Zev Jabotinsky are obviously viewed, and mostly correctly so, as the worldview that is in favor of maximizing territory and the least amount of, at least stereotypically, the least amount of willingness to compromise and more hardline. On the other hand, the irony of Israeli history is that it's often been Likud that has actually, push comes to shove, made territorial compromises leading to peace. And Menachem Begin, again, as the first Likud or revisionist prime minister of Israel is also the first prime minister to make territorial compromises, which, according to his more right-wing hardline base, they weren't happy about that. But to some extent, right, this does give some credence, right? Again, everyone here can judge exactly how much, but it seems to give some credence to the Zev Jabotinsky type mentality of peace through strength as opposed to peace through compromise. Again, depending on one's political disposition, you can figure out exactly how much you want to go into that, right? Probably another equally valid hypothesis is that if a left-wing prime minister attempted to give away land for peace, they can never convince the centrists. But if a right-wing prime minister is doing it, people know that, well, this guy anyway, right? He has our security at heart, right? So, okay, we'll trust him. So perhaps Menachem Begin was able to get the trust more of Israeli center. But again, right, you can see also here, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin are meeting with Jimmy Carter, right? Menachem Begin was able to make this monumental peace treaty to happen. And again, Egypt really becomes the first country in the Arab world to break the sort of famous three no's of the Arab world, which is no peace with Israel, no trade with Israel, and no acknowledgement of Israel. And Egypt becomes the first country, which again, for everything we've talked about Egypt, so from the early 1900s to the 1970s, Egypt is the center of Arab nationalism in the Arab world. All of a sudden, Egypt opens the door for the possibility of communication and peace with Israel. And we know a number of countries end up following, right? Jordan and Israel signed a peace treaty in the mid-90s. And over the past couple of years, Israel has made major strides with many countries in the Arab world. I see we have a couple of comments. In Israel when Sadat came. Yeah, it's quite an interesting, I mean, so just one point about Sadat's first visit to the Knesset. I think it was 1977, but somebody could fact check me on the year. The preparation that the Mossad and Shin Bet underwent when Anwar Sadat was coming, because this was, again, the first time that any Arab politician was ever visiting Israel. And this is after Israel and Egypt had fought 4 wars within 25 years. And so even though most people in Israel were very happy he was coming, because, right, most Israelis were and still are, right, they just want peace, there was obviously a healthy dose of skepticism that this was some, Trojan horse attack. And so some of the preparations are absolutely fascinating in terms of what they did to ensure that this wasn't an attack. Obviously, historically, we know that this was all safe and kosher. Okay. In 1982, we have the Lebanon War, which in terms of Israel's major wars, it's not that important, right? Overall, of course, every war is important in its own way. But one of the reasons why I want to highlight the Lebanon War is that this is the first time in the Israeli public that you actually have Israeli anti-war protests. And one of the reasons for this, and this was, again, Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon to try to eradicate PLO, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, different guerrilla terrorist encampments that were around southern Lebanon. This is the first time that Israel engaged in a war that at least some of the public saw as being an offensive war as opposed to a defensive war. And in the 80s, just to talk about this in terms of the how it filters through the American media, the 1980s is also the first time you start to see Israel being treated in some American media circles as being the aggressor as opposed to the victim. And so one of the things that, again, we can probably endlessly talk about here, and I'm sure we would get 20 different opinions if we open this up for conversation, is questions about how the media covers Israel. And oftentimes Israel is painted just as a unequivocal aggressor as opposed to being a victim. The 1980s is the first time you start to see that in terms of Israel. And one of the points in which people oftentimes talk about is the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which, without going too much into it, there was a group of Christian militias known as the Phalanges that were in southern Lebanon that Israel partnered with. And this group of Christian militias ends up going and basically butchering two entire villages, Sabra and Shatila. And there was all these ethical questions over whether or not Israel knew about it and didn't stop it, knew about it and were too slow to stop it, right? There was a lot of question marks around that, which again created this dose coming out of Israel right? I'm not talking about the international world here, but it was the first time you have Israeli mainstream thinkers and intellectuals starting to say, we think that, Israel has to review some of its military policy and some of its military ethics. And there was a rewriting of the IDF code of ethics after this. And there was all of these reports and all of these, right, investigations done by Israel, by the way. This isn't by the UN or EU or any other group, but this caused Israel to do a lot of internal investigation over what it was doing. And one of the things that Israel actually ends up concluding in terms of this report is that the Israeli government wasn't directly accountable, but was tangentially accountable. And so, right, just for some interesting reading there. We already talked about the creation of Shas, and then the next and probably also just crucial point in the 1980s is the first Intifada, which we touched on a little bit last time. And this is, again, the first time that both internationally and for a lot of Israelis, the idea of the Palestinian people popped up on their radar to some extent. And the first Intifada, while it was somewhat violent in nature, was a lot less violent than the second Intifada, which is oftentimes personified in, bus bombings and pizza shop bombings and coffee shop bombings and all of these things. And one of the things in which a lot of historians think that the first Intifada indirectly led to was Oslo, and was actually a time, right, really the first time that Israel and the PLO came down in discussions, right? We obviously know Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin signing the Oslo Accords, but a lot of historians credit might be the wrong word, but they view the first Intifada as something that changed Israeli popular opinion, right? Not everybody, obviously, but enough Israelis to view the current situation, right, that had been in existence since 1967, so it had been 20 years, as untenable, right? The situation, continued for another 30 plus years afterwards, but this was one of the first major steps that caused a plurality of Israelis to think, hey, the current situation of sort of this limbo situation of the West Bank, is it a part of Israel? Is it not a part of Israel? Are we going to annex it? Are we going to give it away? Are we going to, all of these questions we spoke about last week? The first Intifada is the first time this ended up in the Israeli mainstream. And this leads to Oslo, and we're going to speak about Oslo in a second, but just one point about Oslo, just in terms of wider geopolitics, and then we'll talk about, obviously, Yitzhak Rabin and his legacy, is that the Oslo Accords, even though, as we'll talk about in a second, never actually left stage one, right? The Oslo Accords, were 3 steps that were supposed to happen. And the bad joke is we've been at step 1.5 for about 30 years. The one thing that the Oslo Accords did that was, depending on your perspective, almost unequivocally good, is it opened up peace talks between Israel and Jordan. And right after the Oslo Accords and the Oslo process began, Israel and Jordan signed a peace process in 1994 that, again, has held for the last 30 whatever years. If anybody has any questions or comments, again, feel free to cut me off. Somebody wrote that Shalom Achshav was before Lebanon. So just to respond to that, so Shalom Achshav is the Peace Now, and this was not, right, the left in Israel that was talking about both anti-war, but also, more importantly, Israel pulling out of the West Bank. We spoke about that a lot last week in terms of after 67, especially after 73, the Israeli left was sort of born to some extent out of 1967, as was the Israeli right, in terms of, right, one of the things for many years that separated the Israeli right and left were, what should we do with the West Bank? Are you pro-settlement? Are you pro-pulling out? Are you pro-land for peace? 2-state solution, 1-state solution, right? A lot of questions that now still exist in Israel, but are a lot less in the mainstream. And so what the Lebanon War did was mobilize anti-war protests in a way that almost Vietnam did to some extent in America. Maddie, go for it.
Yeah, so you basically just answered my question, actually. I was going to ask, when you're saying like Israeli mainstream and that it caused like a lot of internal inspection, do you mean like the general public, like were these wars televised, or do you mean like higher ups were very like internally inspecting themselves?
So the answer is both. It was both in terms of a lot of, right, I guess I'll put it the other way, right? In 1948, 67, and 73, Israel had no choice, right? Israel was attacked, right? It's not that Israel could have decided, okay, we're not going to do this. We spoke about 1956 a little bit last time. Israel kind of had no choice because at that time, it was before America really started supporting Israel. It was after the USSR stopped really supporting Israel. So Israel's actually most important ally in the 1950s and early 60s was actually France. Just an interesting side point, France is probably the country that gave Egypt nuclear weaponry, although Israel still denies that they have it. But when France and Britain, basically the only two countries that have your back, say, hey, we need you to help us, right? So Israel had no choice there. Lebanon was, again, more of a toss-up, right? Should we go in, right? And more importantly, I don't think I mentioned this, Israel stays in Lebanon. So Israel stays in southern Lebanon from 1982 to, I believe, around 2000. So 18 years of Israeli military presence in southern Lebanon. And so there was a lot of time for this to build up. It wasn't like, 6-Day War obviously took 6 days. The Yom Kippur War was a couple weeks, maybe a couple months to clean it up. This was an entire generation of people that were living there, right? Soldiers were at risk. People were seeing, it was almost in some ways like Vietnam or Iraq, just this war that was promised to be a very swift, easy war to clean up a region. And 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and then sons are fighting in the same war that their parents fought in, and a lot of the Israeli public at a certain point was thinking, what are we doing here? And so that's what it started. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. So just to clarify, so when you say Israeli mainstream, you just mean like general population?
Yeah, like it wasn't
Okay.
a crazy fringe, right? Obviously, there were fringe left-wing, figures in Israel in 67 and 1973, but if you were protesting against the Yom Kippur War in Israel, you would have been probably rightfully seen as insane. If you were protesting in 1985 against Lebanon, you would have just been seen as a mainstream, center of left or left-wing figure, not, some crazy, nutcase ideologue, for lack of a better term. That's probably an academic term there. Nut-wing ideologue. Okay,
Thank you. No, that was helpful.
Awesome. So Oslo obviously becomes extremely important for a variety of reasons, both good and bad, right? So this is the first time, right, here you have Rabin and Yasser Arafat, which again, this picture really does speak 1,000 words, because for the last 15 years or 20 years before this, Yasser Arafat was seen as the most wanted terrorist on Israel's list. So this wasn't, two people who, had their fair share of political differences. Yasser Arafat was seen by Israel, by America, by most of Europe as a terrorist. Israel had actually tried to assassinate Arafat dozens of times unsuccessfully throughout the 70s and 80s. Arafat was hiding, from everywhere, from the West Bank to Jordan to Lebanon to Europe for a while. And so this meeting was not without its, massive fanfare, both on the this is terrible side, on the this is amazing side, and everything like that. In terms of practical immediate consequences, this legitimized the PLO. And so the Palestinian Liberation Organization was seen before this as a terrorist organization by both Israel and America and most Western countries, and was treated by Israel and America and all these other countries as such. And one of the things that the Oslo process did was immediately legitimize the PLO, which eventually morphed into its two sub-bodies, the Palestinian Authority, which is right now the de facto political leaders of the West Bank, and Hamas, which was a split off from the PLO, which is the terrorist group that is in charge of Gaza, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So, of course, the creation of the PA, and one of the things that Oslo did, and we can discuss it in a little bit more detail in a second, is it actually created a working partnership between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. So something that still happens today is that the Palestinian Authority and Israel work together on security issues of policing the West Bank. And so, people have strong opinions on both sides, but just to sort of paint the facts, and people can decide what they think on their own, is that one of the biggest issues that was in existence from 1967 to 1993 before Oslo is that there was no military or police that were there outside of the Israeli army. And so you had situations where the IDF were the peacekeepers in Ramallah and Bethlehem and Jenin and all of these Palestinian towns. And after the first Intifada, again, during this uprising, it became increasingly clear that one, that was extremely dangerous, and two, it's not the best way to ensure future peace. And so one of the reasons why Oslo was born out, and at least the first stage of Oslo, that again, Israel has been frozen in for 30 years, is to create and allow the Palestinian Authority to have a legitimate police force and to actually have them be under the auspices of Israel. And so even though they're a separate organization, to some extent, and again, you political scientists disagree to exactly what percent of my statement I'm about to say is true, but serving as conduits or puppets to some extent of Israel, right? Some say that's 50% true, some say 100, some say 20, but to some extent they are working in partnership. And in the day-to-day, if you are in Bethlehem or Jenin or Ramallah and you call the police, it's not going to be the IDF showing up, it's going to be the Palestinian Authority. And only when there's increased suspicion of terrorism or other things like that, then you have situations where the IDF will raid those cities. But again, it's not good for anybody when the IDF does that, because it's dangerous for soldiers. Obviously, a lot of people get caught in collateral damage, right? So the joint security of Israel and the PA, while controversial both then and still now, right, does at least maintain some more sense of calm. And then obviously, right, just before we go to Rabin's assassination, this is something that very much enraged, you can imagine, the right wing in Israel, because not only are you legitimizing what they saw and what everybody saw before 93 as a terrorist organization, Rabin was also willing to give up half the land, right? This is the first time since 1947 that anybody was seriously considering a two-state solution. And I believe I actually have, there we go, right? So to actually set up a two-state solution where Israel would pull out of the majority of the West Bank, and I'll make sense of this map in 1 second. And so obviously, if you are on the ideological right in Israel, you are not going to be happy. I'll get back that map in a second. And so there were increased calls in both the Israeli secular right and in the religious Zionist right in Israel against what Rabin was doing. Some of the more nefarious attacks on Rabin were calling him a rodef, which is a halachic term. A rodef is if I am on my way to actively kill somebody. My status in Jewish law is called a rodef, and it is now a mitzvah to kill me. It's one of the only times in Jewish law where you are commanded to kill somebody. And so you could imagine, some of the more farther right religious rabbis in Israel calling Rabin a rodef basically means they are telling their followers, you have a religious obligation to go murder this guy, which is exactly what happens in 95, where Yigal Amir, who is, again, part of one of these communities, murders Rabin. And this is, right, of course, tragic and horrible for all the obvious reasons. This is one of, the, saddest events to some extent in Jewish history, because this is, one of the first times, right? And we spoke actually 2-3 sessions ago about another figure who might have been assassinated in the early 1930s for potentially partnering with the Nazis and Zionism. But this was so much bigger than that. And Rabin, of course, at this point was already an international figure, and he had won a Nobel Prize, and he, was a household name, not just in Israel, but really everywhere in the world. And him being assassinated was such a death blow to not just Oslo, but it really did pit the different factions of Israeli society against each other. And one of the results of this was, again, a growing, what I'll call extreme right in Israel. Right. Another obviously infamous example is Baruch Goldstein, the man who killed dozens of Arab worshippers in Hebron just after Rabin. And so this is obviously, right, a situation that Israel is still in a lot of ways dealing with, right? Just one modern political quip here, and then I'll explain that map, is that a lot of the furthest right political party known as Religious Zionism today. And Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is one of the MKs in the Knesset, was a fan of both Baruch Goldstein, and actually there's a video of him when he was in his 20s, basically with a piece of Yitzhak Rabin's car. And this is in the early 1990s, saying, we have a piece of Yitzhak Rabin's car, next we're going to get him. And so, right, just to why a lot of people in Israel are rightfully afraid of the new government and their influence, right? This is one of the obvious reasons why. And so this ends up being the result of Oslo, right? This was, as I said before, this was only supposed to be the first step of Oslo. There was supposed to be 2 other steps after that would lead to a full Palestinian state, but this is what the current situation is. So they divided the West Bank into 3 different areas, area A, B, and C. Area C, which you can see is obviously the biggest area, is areas that are in control of both, that are run by both Israeli military and Israeli civic law. And so all of the settlements, right, so anywhere that Jews live in the West Bank, that's in Area C. All of the major roads are Area C, right? This is area that is still controlled on the day-to-day by Israel and the Israeli army. Next, you have Area B, which are general areas that have smatterings of Arab villages. And those are areas that are joint control between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. The Palestinian Authority is in charge of the civics, but Israel is still in charge of the police force and everything like that. And then Area A are the big Palestinian cities. So Jenin, Nablus, Ramallah, Bethlehem, right? The major, or Jericho, the major Palestinian cities. And those are areas that Israel is almost never there. And if Israel does go, it's a special operation. And those are areas that are almost always, the day-to-day and even the security are governed by the Palestinian Authority. And so this map, again, is the status quo right now in the West Bank. And you can see this is just another piece that both the right and left in Israel agree on, of the status quo is not great because, right, if you think this whole land should be Israel's, you don't like the jigsaw puzzle nature of this picture. And if you think that the Palestinians should eventually have a state, you probably also do not like the jigsaw nature of this picture. And so, right, you can read through all these interesting attempts to push forward a peace treaty, right? There was one in 2000 by Ehud Barak, another in 2008 by Ehud Olmert, the Trump peace plan in 2016, where he tried to come up with a solution. So you can read through all of these different solutions. And so, right, I'm not going to go through all of these exact details, but for anybody who wants just the nitty-gritty details on all of these attempted 2-state solutions, you can read it. But one of the things that happened in 2000 and in 2008, as Israel continuously offered treaties, is that the Palestinians kept saying no. And so one of the, I think, tragedies, and one of the, really from a Palestinian point of view, I think one of the tragedies is the continuous saying no to a lot of these peace treaties, of which some of them were very good. I mean, you read the Camp David Accords with Ehud Barak and Mahmoud Abbas in 2000, and Israel was offering to give 95% of the West Bank, the entire Gaza Strip, and land swap. So we can go over all the other, this was still Arafat, Abbas was 2008, right? And again, the Palestinian leadership continuously said no, which had the effect on Israeli society, right? A lot of people today claim that the 2-state solution is dead. People can be the own judge of that claim if they want. But one of the reasons why the majority of Israelis have stopped thinking about the 2-state solution and have moved on in their own lives and worries is that their view, again, you can judge whether it's correct or not, is that no matter what they offer, the Palestinians are going to keep saying no, that the majority of Palestinian people and or leaders just want nothing less than the total area, right, which of course would result in, Israel being wiped off the map. And so it creates a lot of skepticism among the Israeli public, right, not to mention the Hamas and Hezbollah, right, these Iranian proxy terrorist groups. Every time there's an attempted peace treaty, they threaten violence. And so Israeli society is correctfully so disillusioned by the idea of a 2-state solution ever happening. And just to take 2 minutes and go through the major points of contention, and then I believe you only have one more slide about Israel, and then we'll have 10 minutes to conclude. So I somehow timed this well. Some of the major points of contention that still today, for people that are interested in the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if you see these terms, just to put a little bit of history behind it, one of the major ones is this question of a Palestinian right of return, which is Palestinians who were living in certain regions before either 1948 or 1967 that either fled, were told to leave by the Arab world, were forced out by Israel, right? Whatever happened there, should they be able to return to the land in which they lived on previously? So this was a major contention point of all of the negotiations, right? Jerusalem, obviously, another major contention point, right? Who gets to be in control of the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa? Should it be an international? Should Jerusalem be split between West and East Jerusalem, right? In probably the best offer that Israel ever gave, which was Ehud Olmert in 2008, he actually offered to divide Jerusalem, which was, again, seen as a major concession. And Mahmoud Abbas, right, and this is actually, right, this took months to finally be rejected, but Mahmoud Abbas, who was the successor after Arafat, who's still the head of the Palestinian Authority, right, said no to that. Right, obviously, safety concerns for Israel is one of the major contentions, and then settlements. We spoke about this a little bit last time, but now there are 500,000 Israeli Jews living in at least the general area that should be a Palestinian state. And just to go back to this map, I know I'm backtracking here a little bit, the areas that are gray, one of the reasons why they're gray is because these are either where settlements are or roads to get to settlements. And so, especially the settlements that are deeper in the West Bank, a lot of them were built with specific intent to not allow a two-state solution. And so in a two-state solution, a lot of the settlements would have to be evacuated, which would be a PR nightmare for any Israeli government trying to do that, especially after what happened in Gaza, which I think is on my last slide. And so settlements is also a big issue. And then the question of acceptance of Israel, right? Israel is only going to engage in negotiations if there's a widespread acceptance of its existence, not if the two-state solution would be, okay, great, we will accept Israel in these borders today, but Israel secretly knows that the Palestinian Authority is plotting just till the next war, right? That's obviously been a major concern of Israel from the outset. And then just the last is division of land, obviously, right? You can read through different attempted drafts of the two-state solution, and everybody has their own map. Okay, last slide on Israel. We have 3 minutes to do this, and then I want time to conclude overall. So the 2000s were obviously a difficult time for Israel, right? In the year 2000, and really coming to its apex in 2003, 2004, is the Second Intifada, which again, you see myriads of buses and pizza shops and, suicide bombings all over Israel, really both in terms of its actual destruction and in terms of the psychological fear that it exerts on Israeli society. And one of the ways in which to think about, right, Israel's interesting because Israel is one of the few Western countries that on average, millennials are more conservative than their parents, right? It's just an interesting political tagline. And one of the reasons is that if you are 30, 35, 40 in Israel today, your formative moments in childhood were post-Oslo. So they were the Second Intifada. They were Israel pulling out of Gaza, which we'll talk about in a second. And this was right after the Arabs said no, right? The Palestinians said no to a two-state solution. And so you have sort of a 1, 2, 3 punch of Israel offering a two-state solution in the year 2000, the Palestinian leadership saying no, the next 3 to 5 years being some of the bloodiest, most dangerous years in Israel's existence, where, by the way, most of the terrorist attacks were not happening in the West Bank. They were happening in, I'll call it Israel proper. This leads, of course, Israel to put up the security barrier, which, again, you can read different accounts of, whether it's controversial, whether it's not controversial, and leading to greater separation between Israelis and Palestinians, right? Before the Second Intifada, it was common, right? If you lived, let's say, in Jerusalem, it would be common to spend your afternoon in Bethlehem as an Israeli and just, go to dinner, right? If you're not religious, or take your car to a mechanic there, or it would be the same thing as, if you live in Orange County, going to San Diego for the day, right? Afterwards, now there really is a border and there's checkpoints, and all the things that we read about were a result of the Second Intifada. And then in 2005, Israel makes the decision to leave Gaza. And right, there's all these accounts of what exactly happened there. But as a result of that, Hamas takes over and really turns Gaza still into a rocket launch, terrorist center. And Israel's had 4 or 5 different wars, depending on exactly what you define a war, with Gaza since 2005. And so these things all together, right, the no received, the Second Intifada, the disengagement from Gaza, and the Hamas takeover has led the majority of Israelis to swing to the center or to the right. Now, we can disagree with that opinion, we can agree with it, whatever, but these are just the facts of why. If one is sitting here in America wondering why Bibi Netanyahu continues to get elected and why more right-wing figures continue to get elected, a lot of it has to do with issues of security, such as all of these things. Right, in 2006, Israel fights another war in Lebanon, this time to try to eradicate Hezbollah cells. And this is, again, mostly important because this is the first time that Iran is really entering the picture. And now in the year 2023, Israel's biggest external threat is no longer any of its immediate neighbors, but it's Iran, which not only is developing nuclear weapons, but is also funding local regional terrorist groups, Hamas and Hezbollah, all around Israel. And then, of course, right, we see the Gaza wars, right, also by an Iranian proxy. So I know that was a little bit quick for those last 20 years, but just to take some big picture overview before we then offer a big picture Jewish historical overview. So today, right, Israel at its 75th birthday, which happened last week, we just hit, I think in the last year or two, the over 50% mark of Jews living in Israel. So I believe the percentages go about 51% of Jews live in Israel. The mid 40s, about 45 or 46% of Jews in the world live in North America. There's about 500,000 Jews still living in France. There's about 500,000 other Jews living scattered throughout the rest of Europe. And then the numbers get much smaller there, right? Some in South America, some still, right? There are pockets of Jews in Iran and South Africa and Australia, but the numbers get to tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands. So really the Jewish world is interesting because we are quite literally split in half between Israel and North America in terms of the bulk of Jewish centers. And one other thing I want to say on that, and this, I guess we can start to offer a little bit of conclusion, is we spent actually a lot of time, probably 3 or 4 months ago, talking about other times in Jewish history where we had 2 centers, right? Most famously, when the Babylonian academies were at their apex, you had a series of Babylonian yeshivot in the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th century CE, and also the other half of the community was in Israel. And so this is not necessarily an unprecedented time in Jewish history. It's actually interesting. We're entering into what a lot of people are starting to call the post-Holocaust era, which we spoke about this a number of, we spoke about this a lot 2 weeks ago when we talked about the Holocaust, but the next generation of Jews are going to be growing up in an age where they are never going to get the chance to talk firsthand with any Holocaust survivor. And so it really is a major question for the Jewish community, both Israel as a country, but also the Jewish community as a whole, how we want to establish the commemoration and memory of the Holocaust. And this is sort of a big question that I think, merits a lot of consideration. Israel obviously was successful in a lot of ways in cultivating the idea of the new Jew, which we spoke about a lot last time. And so I don't want to get too into that. And then there's big questions of power. And I include this because it's an interesting, right, other angle to view Israel, namely that for the last 2,000 years, Jews have had fairly little to no power. And there's been a lot of discussions lately, right, among, right, academics, younger Jews, right, whatever we want to call it, about, right, to quote the Spider-Man tagline, right, with great power comes great responsibility. And not to mistakenly think that power is ipso facto bad, as some do. Power is obviously important, right? And it's a good thing that Israel has a strong military and all of these things, but these are also forcing questions that the Jewish world has not really had to think about for 2,000 years in terms of what do you do when you have a want more power than others, right? How do you use it? All of these questions. And I think this is one of the major questions that the Jewish community, especially in Israel, is going to be contemplating moving forward. And then this new form of anti-Semitism that's arising, I put it here in question form because it is and will always be a debate, but what is the overlapping nature or lack thereof, depending on one's opinion, about being anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic? Just to give my opinion for 1 minute, right? They're obviously connected in some way, right? I do think it is possible theoretically to be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. Usually in practice, most of the time you see anti-Zionist sentiment, it is steeped in anti-Semitism. And one sort of obvious way to think about this is it's too much of a coincidence for there to have been a 2,000-year legacy of people blaming every negative thing on Jews that ever comes up, from plagues to boys going missing to economic collapse, to all of a sudden then there being one Jewish state, that state being demonized and that not be linked to anti-Semitism, right? That seems like a little bit, right? What's it called? Occam's razor would probably deal with that very swiftly in terms of cutting out argument. And so a lot of new forms of anti-Semitism are starting to arise, and they are centered around demonizing or singling out Israel as, instead of Jews or Jewish community, but really it's just a canard for the same thing. And so this is the Israel sense. And just really two thoughts that I wanted to have in conclusion, and then we'll do one Torah source, and then I will thank you all for being with us for 20 weeks. There was an influential essay in the 20th century by a Jewish thinker named Simon Rabinowitz, where he said, "Israel, the ever-dying people." And it's always interesting, and what his claim was, and it's half comedic and half analytic, is that every generation of Jews views themselves at a fundamental precipice where if X, Y, and Z doesn't happen, the future of Judaism is in trouble, right? The next generation doesn't have whatever the it factor is to help Judaism keep going. And that really every generation of Jews thought that because of whatever sociological or intellectual or ideological changes that were happening, right, we're stuck, and we need to act now to save Judaism. Now, you might think based on that introduction that he says this is a bad thing. He actually says that this is a very good thing. And this is one of the motivating factors of Jewish tradition, and one of the reasons why Judaism has been able to last for so long is because we constantly have this, I'll call it worry, but we constantly have this idea that if we don't act and we don't pave the scaffolding for next generations, Judaism will actually die out. And so paradoxically, the view that Judaism may die out or may simmer down if we don't do something is one of the chief reasons why Judaism has been able to stick around for as long as it does. And so, as we go through history, we've spoken about so many pivotal historical moments of which the Jewish community really seemed like they were in trouble, whether it be internal or external, and different competing ideological movements and different ways in which the Jewish community has pivoted. And one of the chief dialectics that's still today in the Jewish tradition is ensuring that we have both the innovation to meet the challenges of whatever the world throws at us, but also make sure that we're steeped enough in tradition that we don't completely forget our roots. And I think the first class I gave the famous psychological or philosophical thought experiment of the ship that has 1 million floorboards that every day you take out one and replace it. And after 1 million days, is it the same ship or not? And so some could argue that, well, no, it's not the same ship because all of the material used in the ship is completely different. But most people, push comes to shove, would say, yeah, it's the same ship. And so Judaism in a lot of ways is like that. And the real challenge, and this is a challenge, I think, for everyone today and moving forward, is ensuring we have this healthy balance of being willing to innovate when we need, and also sticking to tradition and not innovating too quickly. And so for our final source, because I figured we'd end with some Torah study, going back to the Talmud here, and this is a source that I always love concluding anytime I do any long-term classes with, is this source from the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud here. And it starts off by saying there was a certain man who studied and memorized Halacha, Sifra, Sifri, and the Tosefta. Sifra, Sifri, and Tosefta were just ancillary works to the Mishnah. And so there was a certain man, right, presumably in Babylonia, who was a complete master of all of the text, right? This guy was, you know, he was the person who knew everything in Judaism. And so people came to Rabbi Nachman, and Rav Nachman, we actually discussed him in this class, but he was the leader of the biggest yeshiva in Babylonia. And so you're really asking the greatest rabbinic figure of all time to give a eulogy. And Rav Nachman famously said, again, the story is probably not actual history, it's there to teach a lesson. He says back, how can I eulogize him? Should I say, alas, a basket filled with books is lost? And so he says back to him in, you know, fewer words, the point of learning in Jewish tradition is not to know things, and it's not to memorize, and it's not to know a series of facts, and it's not so if somebody wakes you up and says, you know, where did Jews, you know, where was the center of the Jewish world in 1250, you can spit out an answer, right? If learning and studying in a Jewish sense doesn't change who we are in some fundamental way and change how we then view the world and what we then want to do out in the world, to some extent, it's a meaningless exercise in some deep traditional Jewish sense. And so I love the source always, and this is whenever I teach my Jewish history class at UCI, I always do this text right before I give out the study sheet for the final. We're not going to have a final in this class, so don't worry. But right, it's always to highlight the point where don't think that the goal of spending however many weeks is that you now have, you know, a study guide and cheat sheet that you can then know a bunch of facts, right? Think about the few things or the wider trends or the text or the ideas that really speaks to you and is a motivating factor in whatever you're going to do. And that's sort of infinitely more important than any singular fact or data point or historical timeline there. So I wanted to thank you all for, again, this was a lot of fun. I definitely did not mean for this to be a 20-week class in the beginning. I think I said week one, this was going to be 7 or 8 weeks. But thank you so much for sticking with me here. And really, this was a huge, you know, piece of fun for me. I really looked forward to spending the end of my week. I usually start thinking about this on Thursday or Friday. It was a lot of fun, you know, delving into, you know, historical eras and timelines and all these things. And I also got to learn a ton from it. I learned a lot from all of you. And so to next time, but thank you all so much.